Hello, my name is Marie Lamenche. I work for the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. Welcome to the Coronavirus Diaries. Today, I'm happy to talk to Ilan Greenberg, who works for a publication called Coda Story. Thank you, Ilan, for joining this podcast from home. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what Coda Story is about?
Sure. Thank you for having me. So Coda is a journalism platform, and we what we do is we identify overarching crises that are really impacting our world, and we show the continuity and the connections between those crises. So, for example, we're covering disinformation rather relentlessly. From Russia, but really globally as well. And that connects us to another topic that we're covering, which is what we're terming authoritarian tech, the technologies that are fueling the incipient authoritarianism that we're seeing in our world. And that led us to War and Science, another channel that we have that explores the assault on truth and the decline in belief in empirical, in our empirical world, and so all these topics are interconnected and sort of the butterfly effect. And of course, what's happening now with the coronavirus very much is a bullseye for. It's a bullseye for almost every media, but especially for us because it impacts our topics so profoundly.
Yeah, I encourage people to actually subscribe to your newsletter, which provides really useful information about disinformation currently. I want to start perhaps with Russia, because I think you've written an interesting article about it and what the current situation is like over there. You're right there, Russia has obviously spent kind of decades misleading the general public about diseases and public health. And it's probably the case now as well. What is the situation like now in Russia on the ground in terms of the virus?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I should say the article I wrote was with our editor in Moscow, Katya Fomina, and she's really the one on the ground who did the reporting, not I. But I can tell you, right now there's a lot of confusion. There is a lack of transparency. There's also a very how can I say? There's a very strict policy of surveillance and of keeping people inside, but that's been combined with a very lax regime where people have been able to come into the airport without being tested. They're allowed to take public transportation home and then told to quarantine themselves. And that's when the surveillance kicks in, and they can only take out the garbage for about 3 minutes a day. But never mind that, they were allowed to take the metro home. So there is a sort of inconsistency in the way the Kremlin has applied its regime to try to tap down the virus. Putin has used the virus to claim indefinite hold on power, and so this has been a means in which semi-authoritarian regimes that have really accrued power can now exercise it in new ways. And I think for ordinary Russians, a big country, difficult always to generalize, but in Moscow and St. Petersburg especially, there is trepidation, confusion, and a lot of concern about reports in hospitals of chaos and testing that was promised to take only a couple hours, but in fact takes a week. And so, and there is in Russia a longstanding skepticism about the medical establishment, and this feeds into that as well.
And when it comes to Russian disinformation, we're seeing it a lot kind of internationally. But for this crisis in particular, how are Russian pro-Kremlin media handling the crisis, and is it kind of working, or have Russians just, they don't trust local media?
Well, as I said, there is this longstanding skepticism over the medical establishment, and so this certainly feeds into it. I mean, the coronavirus is a great gift to any conspiracy theorist and disinformation purveyor around the world. We're seeing everyone from anti-5G activists, the cellular network pile on. Of course, the vaccine folks are animated. And in Russia, it's very useful both for disinformation as it tries to promote its messaging abroad, and also for its domestic audience, especially as the US has become the #1 country for viral infection. There's a lot of opportunity to weaponize the pandemic to suit domestic political policy agendas.
Yeah. In terms of global trends, we're really seeing this conspiracy theory that COVID-19 was, originated, is actually some bioweapon manufactured by the US. And we've seen this narrative coming from, Russian actors, but also in China, in India, and Iran. How much of this global kind of narrative is actually, just imitation, or in jumping on the bandwagon, or is there real collaborations between several media from and actors from around the world?
Oh, I think it's a lot of jumping on the bandwagon, which is not to say they wouldn't have necessarily come up with it on their own. They probably would have, because it's such an obvious, how can I say? It's of course that's what the disinformation forces are jumping at, and so I think even if it hadn't originated with certain circles, I think almost everyone would have jumped on that.
And I think in your newsletter, I think on Wednesday, you mention, or your team mentions, that the narrative coming from the Iranian regime has kind of changed as well, and it's becoming more kind of proactive anti-US propaganda. Can you tell me more a little bit about this? How that the narrative has evolved in Iran? Because we know the situation is pretty bad over there.
Yeah, it seems pretty dire. Of course, we don't know how bad it is. But in fact, the extent to which the Iranians are suffering from the pandemic is itself cloudy with misinformation, and so it's difficult to know. The reports are that the Iranian government has shifted. Well, shifted might be the wrong word. Has emphasized what it claims are the American roots of the pandemic, and really have tried to weaponize anti-American hostility around the virus. This has been amplified because there have been issues of overcompliance with sanctions. The U.S. of course is leading a campaign to isolate and sanction Iran. Corporations and entities like universities all over the world have to comply with these sanctions, but there is this phenomenon of overcompliance, and there was an issue with the Johns Hopkins map not being available to Iranians,
Mm-hmm.
which is not part of any sort of sanctions regime, but may have been a result of overcompliance. So on both sides, there's, I mean, as usual between the U.S. and Iran, there's very little clarity, and I think the Iranian government is seeking some advantage by capitalizing on that.
In terms of global trends, how do you think, how much is disinformation and even denialism on the part of authoritarian governments? How much is it impacting the response to the pandemic, both at home and abroad? Because basically, there's been obviously a clear narrative that China just denied the crisis for a long time, and it continued to spread. And if the Chinese regime had been more truthful, we could have done more earlier.
Yeah, and I think that's incontrovertible. That the PRC buried news of the virus, and that enabled it to spread, in really an extreme way over the first couple of months back in November and into December. But since then, the Chinese have been very effective in its strategies and tactics to get a handle on the virus, and it's been non-authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes that have capitalized on the virus to implement profound surveillance, strip away privacy rights, for certain government officials to take on new powers, to extend their powers. As I said before, Putin has done that. But the American president, Trump, has seized on, he's calling himself a wartime president. So both the rhetoric and the policies of a wartime presidency is something that he's starting to use. Mm-hmm. And then in Europe, Orban has basically taken dictatorial powers. Mm-hmm. And in Poland, they're going ahead with their presidential election because it is going to favor the party in charge. So this has been a great opportunity for governments, both democratic and authoritarian, to either consolidate power or to grab new powers.
Yeah, we will be speaking to someone from Freedom House later today, who will be also speaking about the dangers of these health crises for, and the powers of authoritarian governments, or, even democratic governments, and the dangers for privacy and surveillance and human rights in general. I know that you also looked at more kind of underlooked cases of India and Qatar and Afghanistan. Can you tell me more about the situation over there? Because we're not getting a lot of information.
Yeah, I mean, what's remarkable, right, about the pandemic is that it's impacting every country on earth. And in India, where the virus hasn't taken hold on, it's probably the place doctors are most, epidemiologists are most worried about because of the population density and the lack of a healthcare infrastructure. But India is also a great petri dish for disinformation. And on WhatsApp groups and social media online, we're already seeing just a ton of disinformation around the virus. We can expect that to accelerate. In the Middle East, what we're seeing is the virus being used by regimes to amplify rivalries that already exist. And so, you mentioned Qatar. The Saudis have been very aggressive in trying to associate the Qataris with the virus. In our newsletter today, we talk about how in Egypt, they have identified the Muslim Brotherhood as the purveyors of the virus, and so on. And so, you see around the world governments being opportunistic and seeing an opportunity, seeing a way in which the virus can amplify the messaging it already has underway, and then, as I said before, it also presents new opportunities. Mm-hmm. It's small countries where some of the worst kind of disinformation is being conveyed.
Okay, so last question: what's next for Coda? So a lot of work these days.
Yeah, I mean, we're being kept busy. We're covering all the countries you just mentioned, but we're looking at it through the prism of disinformation, but also authoritarian tech, surveillance, and facial recognition, and the technologies that are coming into play, as well as I said, the war on science, looking at how the virus is challenging the scientific community. And then we also have plans for some new topics that we're going to launch, we hope very soon, as well as some other initiatives. So we're growing, and our reporters are being kept very, very busy.
I bet, yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and I wish you good luck, and good luck with personal life, being stuck at home, and then also with Coda.
Thank you. Same to you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.